Hi, I'm Bill Sanders, and this is WatchArtSci, the art and science of watch collection. Today, what I'd like to do is to see if we can find the best possible affordable watches. Now, when I'm talking about affordable, I'm putting those in big quote marks. These are watches under $10,000, some significantly under $10,000. And I thought it would be interesting to see what the Grandmasters of Watchmaking had to say. Well, back in 2013 in Singapore, they had a meeting of four of the top Grandmasters of Watchmaking in the world. And they asked them, they said, without naming your own brand, what would be a watch that you would recommend that is affordable, something under $10,000? Okay, now this is back in 2013 in Singapore when these four men got together and they were talking about different things in the watch industry and watchmaking and so forth, and that was one of the questions that came up. So let's take a look at these. The first one is Philippe Dufour. And Philippe Dufour is pretty much almost like a legend in watchmaking. The watches he makes are just beautiful, and they're almost impossible to get. And if you get them, you can expect to pay between $100,000 and $1,000,000. Okay, out of my price range and most of ours, but he had what I wanted to do is see what would he recommend for something that was affordable, but he thought was a good watch. Okay, second is Laurent Fleurier. Laurent Fleurier is a very interesting guy. He worked for Patek Philippe for 37 years. And then he said, well, I'm going to start my own watch company, and he did. He's won a number of Grand Prix at the Grand Prix de Horologie de Genève. And his watches, he makes beautiful watches, and he has a little shop. Now his watches are, like most of them, they don't look super complicated. He has made super complicated ones, but for the most part, he likes nice, clean watches that people will use every day. The third Grandmaster is a gentleman named Roger Smith. Now, Roger Smith is an Englishman, and he has his companies in England. It's not something that was moved to Switzerland, so you can say Swiss made. He's very proud of the fact that the English have a very, very strong tradition of making excellent watches, and he wants to sort of revive it, to bring it back to England. Now, his watches, I don't think he's ever entered any into the Grand Prix. He only makes about 10 a year, and people have a very hard time getting them. I took a look to see if any were available, and I saw one that was, I think it was priced about £120,000. That's about $250,000. That's a lot. So his watches are wonderfully done, and they're very much sought after. The next person is Kari Voutilainen, and he's the kind of guy, he's the kind of grandmaster watchmaker who, at a drop of a hat, will see something he likes made by somebody else and just tell him how much he admires it. In fact, most of these grandmasters are. There was all of them. If they see something they like, then they say, well, it's not as good as what I make. They're quite the opposite. They love watches, and that's why I think they're interesting to watch collectors. These are not guys who, they could all probably quadruple their income if they wanted to increase the number of watches they made. But they're not like that. They love the art and craft, the art and science of creating something really wonderful. Okay, so let's take a look and see what watches they recommended that were under $10,000. The first one was by Philippe Dufour, was the Nomos. And Nomos is a German company, and as are a number of other very good watches, such as A. Longenson. But the Nomos is very affordable, and as you can see, they have, to me, what I always call sort of a Bauhaus, very clean, very functional look to them. And this particular one is a for world time, a GMT type of watch, and highly affordable. But this is something now. This is one of the Grandmasters of Watchmaking is suggesting that. Okay, let's take a look at the next one. We're going to take a look at Kari Vuitton Lonens. Now, what he recommended is a watch that was made in his neighborhood. Okay, he thought, well, since they asked me, I'll recommend one that's near my village, and this will help the village out, which is, I don't know. He likes so many different watches. But I'm glad he did, because it was one I'd heard about and I didn't know much about. And this is a Parmigiani Fleurier. And this watch is just beautiful. I mean, the watches they make are really amazing. And they're a little pricey, and they don't really come too much below $10,000. And the example that I found was sort of right near about as near to 10,000 as you can get, $5 under $10,000. But one of the things about this watch that I liked, among many things, just as a gorgeous, clean watch, are the hands. On the hands, they have the centers are filled with porcelain, a white porcelain. I thought, wow, what a gorgeous watch. Now, again, these are under $10,000, but no, this was a new one, a condition 0, but not a lot. Okay, the next one is Roger Smith. Now, here he's an Englishman. He loves English watches, and there are a number of English watches, but that's not what he recommended. What he recommended is something that may surprise a lot of you. He recommended the Rolex. In fact, he has a Rolex Explorer, so I put a Rolex Explorer up there, but generally he said Rolex. His description of Rolex, so I might sort of give cringe some Rolex owners, is, well, they're good solid watches and nothing ever changes. And oh, wait a minute, they have all kinds of innovations. But he says, this is something that's reliable. You can get one, you can be born with one and die with one, and they're great watches, which I think was really sort of neat. I mean, there's a poor Rolex gets beaten up by so many people that, here you have a Grandmaster saying, wow, I've got a Rolex, I've got one. And this guy makes 10 watches a year, and he could buy Rolex, at least a store full of them, for what he gets for a single watch. So I thought that was sort of neat. Now the final one is by Girard-Perregaux. His recommendation is for a Rolex as well, except he specified a certain type of Rolex. He said a Daytona, but not just any Daytona. He said one from the 50s. Well, I don't think they made Daytonas in the 50s. I think the early 60s was when they first had them. They had a sort of a pre-Daytona chromomat or something like that they had. But he said a good stainless steel Daytona was what he suggested. Well, there are a lot of different Daytonas. I really didn't know very much about them, to tell you the truth, and so I thought, well, I better find out something about them. Here's one of the Grandmasters of Watchmaking saying, hey, this is a good watch to get. And so I did. And one of the first ones I found was, much to my surprise, had a zenith movement in it. Now, most Rolexes have in-house movements, but this particular Daytona, and they acted like, well, this is sort of like a, you know, that's really a good one. And it was available for just under $10,000. Only one that I found under $10,000. Rolex Daytonas aren't generally considered an under, even the stainless steel ones generally aren't considered an under $10,000 watch. Those things have, they go for a lot more than that. Fascinating history though, how they started with the Daytona races and all of the race fans that had them. Now, and looking at this, here we have, if I don't ask this, you may have noticed this. Well, what's, you know, am I going to get my money back on this thing if I buy it? I never asked that question, and I know that Rolexes do pretty well in terms of holding their value. But as we saw in an earlier video, it's still, you knock off about 25% every time you sell it. But still, it's interesting to see that two different grandmasters saying, hey, if you could have a watch under $10,000, what would it be? Two of them said, get a Rolex. And Laurel Fleurier said something a little different, get a Daytona. But on the other hand, Roger Smith said, any Rolex you want is a good one. And he had one that he says is sort of his, he wears all the time, is his Explorer 2. So I thought that was sort of cool. I since I don't have a Rolex, I haven't got around to one yet. I may get one soon. We'll see. But that I think is very interesting. Also, too, finding out about watches I know nothing about is very exciting. And the Parmigiani Fleurier, hey, that's a gorgeous watch that I knew nothing about. I think a lot of times people see that and they think it's a Panerai, but it's a very, very different watch company. Their stuff is in-house, the movements, really gorgeous watches. And finally, of course, is the economical Nomos. That was so great to see that from these grandmasters. So, if you're interested in getting a watch recommended by the best watchmakers in the world, you might want to consider one of these watches. I know that a lot of people already considered and bought Rolexes, but the other two as well, I think, look like some very, very interesting watches. And I think you can probably find some very, very good buys on a Nomos. The Parmigiani, I don't know. I just don't know because, but I'm going to be sort of looking around and see if there's one that comes my way that is, that's something I can afford. And again, like I said, I'm not an investment advisor, and I really, I wouldn't suggest, at least for me, I'm going to buy and sell watches and try to make some money. I don't. I'm a collector, don't have any sense at all when it comes to spending on watches. Love them all. Okay, that's all for today, and we'll see you next Friday. If you like, you can subscribe. I'm having a lot of fun with talking with different people. Leave a comment. Love comments, and what you think of these recommendations. And yeah, we get this conversation going. But it's okay to go ahead and subscribe now. All right, that's all for today. See you next week.